This is 1800s to 1839, and this is probably, these are the earliest examples I have that are actually survived. There's not much around that's not in museums, that's still out there for the general public, but most of the cottons being produced there were all still imported from England and France, and they were highly detailed, and they were using turkey red by then, because turkey red was invented in 1795, 1798, but just different styles of fabric. These very detailed roller prints were all the rage, and fabric was quite expensive back then too, the chintz and what have you. So I brought some material here that talks about that as well. And then after they started making domestic cottons in America, it was a little bit later. This is like from 1840 to about 1859. There was a lot more available. And the color palette starts to change in there. There's a little bit different types of fabrics being produced and being used. Whatever's with the fashion. There was a big resurgence of national pride, and there was more red, white, and blue looking things going on during that time. A lot of women made political quilts, and it was also the crazy quilt period and Queen Victoria's reign period, and there was a lot of fussy, more is more type fabric and furnishing going on. So things changed. This is when Queen Victoria was made more heavily into her mourning period. Her mother had died, and also Empress Eugenie, her husband had died, and they changed the fashion. Things got a lot darker, so you can tell just from this period to this period, there was a big change, big sweep. And this lasted, into the early part of the 20th century. In the First World War, there was a scarcity, again, of fabrics available. So you can see that this is almost monochromatic looking. There's not a lot of difference in things that were available. A lot more plaids, homespun looking type fabrics. And then during the Great Depression, people were depressed. But anyway, so they needed a lighter palette to brighten them up. And that's when you see the 30s and the 40s, the bright pastels coming in. Thanks for everybody coming today. And the way I kind of organized the program is I thought we'd go through and we would talk about some of the historical things that were going on during the time that influenced fashion, and of course then that in turn influenced quilt making. And one of the things I wanted to find out from you guys, if there's anything special that you had an expectation about today, because then I can make sure that I cover it. So is there anybody that wanted to know something special or anything before I get started? Yes, ma'am.
Just how to take care of an old quilt and display it properly and preserve it.
Quilt care, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. All righty. Well, I did make up some class handouts, and how we're going to do this is going to be very interactive. We're going to go through here, and you're going to help me date some of those tops back there. So we're going to see how good information I give you. And by the time you all leave here today, I believe in the each one teach one method. So I can't imagine me sitting down and piecing with wool. Piecing with linen might be a little tough, pulling it through fabric. And silk thread was wonderful to work with, but it's fragile. And so the quilt making prior to 1800 reflected that, and what you see is a lot of broderie purse quilts and that kind of thing that were, using large pieces of printed fabric and then just appliquing them down on the plain ground. And they did a lot of whole cloth quilts where they could use the linen and the silk. So the first 3-ply cotton thread was developed in 1812, in Scotland. We think about that, that's wild, isn't it? That that was happening, it's all because of something else was going on, a war was going on. So, and then not to be outdone, another countryman, J&P Coates, also opened a thread mill a year later. And of course, someone I'm sure, stole the process from Mr. Clark, for Mr. Coates to use. In 1785, turkey red dye was finally perfected. And we're going to talk a lot about turkey red as we go through the fabric timeline because it was real important. It was a color fast dye. So when we look at the fabrics on this board, the preferred fabric back in that time, during this time for making quilts, was chintz. This is just a little portion of a floral. And this is actually a chintz design on this wood block. But this is just a little portion, one little block, that was used for printing fabrics back then, before they invented the roller prints. My friend Cressy was kind enough, I talked to her last night, because, yeah, you hardly ever see big pieces of chintz around anymore, and if you do see them, usually they're not out where you can come to them. This is actually a quilt back from an old log cabin quilt. The chintz is older probably than the front. But look at that chintz fabric, and you can see that it's highly detailed. And this goods were about 26 to 28 inches wide when it was produced. And this still has the glaze or the sheen on it. Madder is actually the natural stuff that actually turkey red comes from, brown comes from, and purple all come from the same one ingredient, madder. And so when you hear people talk about madder reds, you kind of go, that's kind of a misnomer because there were madder browns, there were madder reds, madder purples. They all came from that same plant grouping. And indigo, I have to mention indigo during this time period too, because indigo is the earliest known color fast dye. There's fragments of indigo cloth that are over 5,000 years old, which is just like, it's a real indigo, it's dyed all the way through. The synthetic indigos that they developed around the turn of the century don't go all the way through. So this is kind of like what's going on during this time period. Red and black prints. The reds, the dark turkey reds, were mostly patterned, and so they used like this, and also reds that had yellow and white in them, as well as this kind of picotage, this little circle business was going on. And this was like a big discovery too. Chlorine bleach was discovered in 1788. It was discovered as part of a dye process, not certainly as a cleaning process. And if you really want to get into reds, there's a great book, it's called The Red Dyes, but you have to be a real maniac to read this kind of thing. But just like me. And natural dye stuffs also, there was not necessarily obviously not in England and France at the time, but at the same time that they were going crazy over turkey red down in South America, the Indians down there were dyeing things wonderful scarlets by using a little scaly insect that grows on a cactus plant. And they're still using that. So like when you look at fabrics from Guatemala and that kind of area, I know there's some nice pieces I can show you here that are very old. Like this, you've probably seen tones of that, even in rugs and that kind of thing. That's from cochineal dye. Pirates used to try and steal the insects, the little dried insect, from ships. Can you imagine? Because it was expensive. It was like having gold. And the same thing with indigo. It takes 100 pounds of indigo to produce 4 ounces of indigo dye. So it was a tradable good, and countries, a lot of their economy was built on dyes. So it's not just a pastime. There was a lot going on with fabrics and dyes. Does anybody have any questions about this portion? Yes.
Catherine, were there specific patterns that were used at
yes,
you
sorry.
there typical of that time?
What was going on was a lot of strippy quilts. We don't see strippy quilts hardly at all. England, there's a lot of strippy quilts being built there, and the strips of plain fabric, a lot of times chintz, and then the next strip would be just simple 4 patches or 9 patches set on point. And then also the 8-point star and the broderie purse quilts were real big in that period, and also the tree of life. And By that I mean the kind of looks like East Indian tree of life. You've probably seen quilts like that in books. And then they had a big resurgence as kits back in the 20s and 30s, those patterns. And the quilts were big, 94 to 120 inches because the beds were so big. So we look at tops too. We see a lot of tops that were really big to cover these beds. And there was a lot of quilts you find from that time period also have the 4-poster cutouts for them, for the bedsteads. And rarely see any applique borders. If you see a quilt that looks like these colors without a border, then you're probably right on your dating. If it has an applique border, mostly it's going to fall into this next time period. And that's like a clue that you can use when you're dating. Lots of medallion sets, sunbursts, and these Mariner's Compass blocks. This was real popular. It was also a popular way to showcase the fabrics because you could use big pieces of them. So not a lot of geometric designs, and the geometric designs that were being used were fairly simple. Linsey Woolsey quilts. Linsey Woolsey's kind of funny. There is no fabric really. There's no, it's, when people think of Linsey Woolsey, they think, oh, it has linen in it. And it usually isn't. It's usually cotton and wool. So, moving right along, this next period, there is more going on here. The sewing machine was invented, big deal, in 1846. That was huge. It was supposed to revolutionize American women's lives. And well, all women's lives, I guess, for that matter. The indigos that we see from this time period, a lot of them have these chrome orange colors in them. And there's a quilt hanging at the museum right now that's got a lot of this indigo and chrome orange in the sashing. And you'll see it when you first walk in the museum. It's on the right-hand side. And it has some really good examples of these indigo and chrome orange prints in it. So be sure to catch that when you go over there. And Isaac Singer was the first gentleman to ever come up with the idea of selling something to women on the installment plan, sewing machines. It was a big deal. They made them affordable for everyone. And so that changed the way women constructed quilts. But still, a lot of them still did all their patching by hand because they could do it in small, manageable units. But that's when we first start to see applique put down by sewing machine. They wanted to try it out, and a woman was real proud if she could do a good job of appliquing with that sewing machine. That was a big deal. Get your magnifying glass out and figure out what kind of thread were they using to put this together. But then people like me collect thread as well, so I have 3-ply cotton, and I have 6-cord cotton, and then I have also 3 2-ply cotton in my collection. So, and linen thread, that kind of thing. But there was a lot going on during this time period because of the Great Migration West. And that influenced quilting styles as well. You see lots of autograph blocks and chimney block quilts, and a lot more patchwork instead of the whole cloth type looking quilts. There was a lot more patchwork, and this is when the applique quilts really started to flower. So that was a huge thing. And we'll look at some red and white applique tops. You see press, there's my goodness. Under there. So even seeing a double pink in a quilt isn't necessarily any clue about how old it is. It could be from 1840 to 1920. They were producing double pinks. People loved them. And they were also called Merrimack pinks because there was a fabric mill there that a gentleman developed, and he printed a lot of these double pinks. And also called cinnamon and a bunch of other things too. But double pink is kind of universally accepted. And the poison greens, or whatever you want to call these, Lenore gave me some great little pieces of poison green a couple of years ago too that she had salvaged from something, and from my quilt repair. And these were over dyed. Green was a tough color, green and purple. They just, all the natural things that were out there for dyeing fabric, and it's just, they couldn't come up with a green that would last. It was, they had like mint greens. This green was a one-step dye process, that kind of minty green. They did well with that, but boy, these, you know, just like a true green, like something like a Kelly green, they just could not get it done in one step. So these greens that you see like this, these kind of limey ones, the poison greens, those are all over dyes. They started out as yellow cloth and were over dyed with indigo. It was the only way to get greens. So you find them in every different shade in there, but they were over dyes. Like this one is an over dye, but see how it almost has like a little brown color to it? And they were still using chromium lead up until, you know, in some countries up until like the 1930s. They didn't really realize it was giving them lead poisoning.
So all the purple orange is
Yes. Up until about 1910, 1920, they changed the process. So yeah, when you look at that stuff and then you think, ooh,
and
it's,
those greens?
no,
Just carnation.
just the chrome orange or the cheddar orange.
Why do they call it double pink? Did that mean
Oh.
something? Did they dye it twice?
Yes, they did. Like they laid on, like on this one, you can see kind of like, it has like a little ferny pattern. You've seen lots of those double pinks. They have like little seaweed looking things. And it was a dark pink. And then they over dyed it again. And on this one, they probably bleach spotted it too because it has little white dots. So they were dyed twice to get that nice color. And there's a lot of detail in a lot of these double pinks. This one has little stripes and seaweeds in it. And this peach color, you don't really think about this peach color being real old, but that kind of weird little peach, or some people call it butterscotch color, that's been around since 1830 to 1840. See it here? And you don't really think of that, I don't think of that color, I guess, as an old color, but you see it a lot. American mills were going gung-ho by now, exporting fabric. After that ban that I talked to you about the roller printing ban was lifted and the textile workers could flood to America, the first year after that, in 1831, over 120 million yards of fabric were being produced in domestic mills. And that was a third of what England was producing at the time, who had, you know, been doing all this fabric production for years and years.